They said she was damaged property, a small, uneducated woman, broken by a lifetime of brutal labor and marked by a scar on her forehead that was a permanent reminder of a slave owner's rage. They said the strange visions that seized her, the sleeping spells that would drop her to the ground without warning, were signs of a broken mind. In the cold calculus of the slave market, she was worth less than a healthy field hand, a flawed asset in a system built on human commodification. They saw a liability. They had no idea they were looking at a prophet. They saw a runaway. They couldn't comprehend they were staring at a general. America would come to call her Moses, a name whispered in the slave cabins of the South and spoken with reverence by abolitionists in the North. But even that grand title would fall short. For this one woman, armed with a deep faith, an unshakable will, and a profound understanding of the wilderness, would not just lead her people out of bondage. She would return to the heart of the serpent's lair with a rifle in her hand and wage a secret war against the very nation that had enslaved her. To understand the warrior, you must first understand the world that forged her. Araminta Ross, the girl who would become Harriet Tubman, was born into the living hell of slavery on a Maryland plantation around 1822. Her world was a cage of absolute control, where every sunrise brought the certainty of back-breaking work and the possibility of casual, soul-crushing violence. From her earliest memories, life was a lesson in pain. She was loaned out as a child to masters who would whip her for letting a baby cry. She was forced to work in icy river waters, the cold seeping into her bones, leaving her with a sickness that would linger for life. Her body was not her own. Her time was not her own. Even her family was not her own. She watched in horror as two of her sisters were sold and dragged away in chains, their screams a permanent echo in her memory. This was the foundational trauma of slavery. The constant gnawing fear that the people you loved could be ripped away from you at any moment, for any reason, and you would be powerless to stop it. The moment that would define her life came in her early teens. She was sent to a dry goods store on an errand when an overseer cornered a runaway slave who had left the fields without permission. The overseer demanded that the young Araminta help him tie the man up. She refused. As the runaway made a break for the door, the overseer grabbed a 2-pound metal weight from the counter and hurled it at him. But he missed. The weight struck Araminta directly in the head. The blow was catastrophic. It fractured her skull, leaving her unconscious and bleeding on the floor of the store. Her master showed no sympathy. She was thrown onto a pile of rags in a slave cabin and left, without medical care, to live or die. She did not die, but she was never the same. The injury left her with a lifetime of debilitating headaches and, most critically, a form of narcolepsy. Without warning, she would be overcome by a powerful wave of sleep, collapsing wherever she stood. But something else happened in the wake of that injury. She began to have visions, intense, vivid dreams that she believed were direct communications from God. In these visions, she saw prophecies, saw pathways through forests, felt a divine presence guiding and protecting her. To the white world, this was proof of her brain damage. To Harriet, it was the source of her unshakable faith. The weapon that had been used to break her had, in a strange and mystical way, connected her to a higher power. It forged an iron certainty in her soul. God had a purpose for her. He had spared her for a reason. This divine purpose was her secret shield as she grew into a young woman. She learned the landscape of her prison with an intimacy that only the hunted can know. While working in the fields and forests, she memorized the secret paths, the swampy marshes, the dense woods of Maryland's eastern shore. She learned to read the stars, to follow the North Star, that celestial beacon of freedom. She learned which plants were edible, which mosses grew on which side of a tree, how to move through the wilderness without making a sound. Her master saw a field hand. God, she believed, was training a soldier. The final impetus to escape came in 1849. Her owner died, and Harriet heard whispers that she and her brothers were about to be sold further south into the brutal cotton and rice plantations of the Deep South. It was a fate widely regarded as a death sentence. The thought of being permanently separated from her husband, a free black man named John Tubman, and the rest of her family was more terrifying than the thought of death in the wilderness. She decided to run. She tried to convince her brothers to come with her, but after a short distance, their fear overcame them, and they turned back. So, Araminta Ross, now Harriet Tubman, went on alone. With nothing but the North Star and her faith as a guide, she plunged into the wilderness, beginning a 90-mile journey through a landscape teeming with slave patrols and bounty hunters. Every snapping twig was a threat. Every barking dog was a potential alarm. She was a fugitive, a piece of property that had stolen itself, and the price on her head was very real. But her fear was eclipsed by something far more powerful: the vision of freedom she had held in her mind for a lifetime. Harriet's first journey to freedom was not a simple sprint. It was a grueling, nerve-shredding odyssey through the shadow world of the Underground Railroad. This was not a literal railroad of steel tracks and steam engines. It was a clandestine network of secret routes and safe houses, a fragile chain of human decency stretched across a landscape of brutal oppression. Its conductors were a courageous, interracial coalition of free blacks, Quakers, and other white abolitionists who risked their lives and property to help fugitives. Its stations were hidden rooms, secret cellars, and secluded barns where runaways could rest for a few precious hours before continuing their perilous journey north. For Harriet, navigating this world was a masterclass in the arts of deception, improvisation, and reading human nature. She traveled almost exclusively by night, the darkness her greatest ally. During the day, she would hide in swamps, digging herself into the mud, sometimes with only her head above water, breathing through a reed as slave patrols passed just feet away. She learned to use the sounds of the wilderness as a cover, moving during the howl of the wind or the call of a screech owl, a sound she would later adopt as one of her signals. Her faith was her constant companion. In moments of extreme doubt and terror, when the barking of bloodhounds grew closer, she would pray, and always, she would say, a sense of calm would wash over her, a feeling of divine protection, a vision of the correct path to take. She would follow these visions with absolute certainty, making decisions that seemed reckless to others, but which always proved to be right. She was learning to trust the voice of God that spoke within her, a voice forged in the trauma of her head injury. When she finally crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, into the free city of Philadelphia, the moment was so overwhelming, it was almost surreal. She would later describe it with a simple, profound beauty. When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But this euphoria was quickly followed by a deep and aching loneliness. She was free, but her family, her parents, her siblings, her husband were not. Freedom, she realized, was incomplete if it was not shared. It was in that moment, in the stark contrast between her own liberation and her family's continued bondage, that Harriet Tubman's true mission was born. She was not content to be a passenger on the Underground Railroad. She would become its most legendary conductor. What she did next was, by any measure, insane. A lone, illiterate woman with a price on her head, she chose to turn around and go back. Back into the slave state of Maryland. Back into the very jaws of the system she had just escaped. Her first rescue mission in 1850 was to retrieve her niece and her 2 children, who were about to be sold at auction. Using her knowledge of the backwoods and the network, she successfully guided them to freedom. And so it began. For the next decade, Harriet Tubman would make an estimated 13 trips back into the South, personally guiding more than 70 enslaved people, family, friends, and strangers, to the North. She became a master of spycraft, a brilliant field operative in a secret war. She developed a complex system of codes and signals. She would use spirituals, slave work songs, to communicate messages in plain sight. A song like "Wade in the Water" was not just a hymn, it was a direct instruction to fugitives to get into the river to throw the pursuing bloodhounds off their scent. "Go Down, Moses" was a signal that she, the deliverer, was in the area and ready to lead a party north. She was a ghost, a rumor, a legend whispered in the slave quarters. They called her Moses, the prophet who would lead her people to the promised land. The slave owners knew of Moses, this mysterious figure who was spiriting away their most valuable property, but they had no idea who she was. They imagined a large, powerful man, a master of disguise. They never suspected that the person causing them so much financial and psychological damage was a 5-foot-tall woman with sleeping spells. Her methods were strict and absolute because the stakes were life and death. She carried a small pistol, and she made it clear to every group of fugitives she led that there was no turning back. Fear was the enemy, and it could doom them all. If someone became too terrified to go on, if their cries threatened to give away their position, Harriet would pull out her gun, press it to their head, and say, "You'll be free or die." It was a brutal, terrifying choice, but a necessary one. A single captured fugitive could be tortured into revealing the routes, the safe houses, and the names of the conductors, destroying a vital link in the chain of freedom. No one she ever threatened in this way chose to turn back. Her will was stronger than their fear. She was a master of disguise, sometimes dressing as an old, feeble woman, using her small stature to her advantage. Other times, she would pose as a man, a field hand on his way to another plantation. She developed an uncanny ability to sense danger, a 6th sense, honed by years of living as prey. She would later recount moments when one of her sleeping spells would overcome her at a critical juncture. She would collapse by the side of the road, and her party would have to hide her in the woods. When she awoke, she would often declare that they had to change their route, that she had seen a vision of a slave patrol waiting for them on the path ahead. And she was always right. To the fugitives she led, these moments were not signs of sickness. They were proof of her divine guidance. They saw her as a woman who literally walked with God. Her reputation grew with each successful trip. The bounties on her head multiplied, eventually reaching a staggering sum. Some historians estimate as high as $40,000 in today's money. She became the most wanted property in the South, and yet she was never caught. In all her years as a conductor, she famously never lost a passenger. This flawless record was a testament to her meticulous planning, her iron discipline, and what she firmly believed was the hand of God protecting her. She was not just leading people, she was waging a one-woman war of economic and psychological sabotage against the institution of slavery. Every person she freed was a direct financial loss to a slave owner. Every successful escape was a story that spread like wildfire through the slave quarters, planting seeds of hope and rebellion. She was not just a conductor, she was an insurgent. And soon, the nation's own massive, bloody insurgency would give her a new and even more dangerous battlefield on which to fight. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 did not mark an end to Harriet Tubman's fight. It marked an escalation. For a decade, she had been a guerrilla fighter in a Cold War against slavery. Now, the nation itself was engulfed in a hot war, and the stakes were raised to an apocalyptic level. For Harriet, this was the fulfillment of the prophecies she had seen in her visions. This was Armageddon, the final bloody reckoning that God had promised would precede the Jubilee of Freedom. She knew immediately that she could not sit on the sidelines. Her skills, honed over a decade of clandestine operations in enemy territory, were not just useful to the Union cause, they were unique. No general in the Union Army possessed her intimate knowledge of the Southern landscape, her experience in moving covertly through hostile terrain, or her established network of trust among the enslaved population. She was, without question, one of the most qualified intelligence assets the Union had. She made her way to a Union-occupied territory in South Carolina, the same sea islands she had heard about as a conductor, and offered her services to the Army. At first, the Union officers didn't know what to do with her. They saw a small, illiterate black woman, and, falling back on the prejudices of the era, initially assigned her to work as a nurse and a cook for the newly freed slaves who were flocking to the Union camps. Harriet accepted the roles without complaint, but immediately began to demonstrate her true value. As a nurse, she showed an incredible knowledge of folk remedies and herbal medicine, using plants from the local swamps to brew cures for dysentery and other diseases that were ravaging the camps. She seemed to possess a natural immunity to smallpox, allowing her to tend to the sickest soldiers without fear. She became a figure of comfort and healing, a mother to the sick and dying. But all the while, she was doing what she did best, gathering intelligence. The freedmen and women in the camps trusted her. They had heard the whispers of Moses for years, and now she was here, in the flesh. They spoke to her in ways they would never speak to a white Union officer. They told her about the movements of Confederate troops, the locations of their encampments, the placement of their sentries and torpedoes in the rivers. They gave her a detailed, real-time map of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, a level of human intelligence that was priceless. Harriet began to organize this information, building a network of scouts and spies from among the local black population. She recruited river pilots who knew the treacherous coastal waterways, woodsmen who could track enemy patrols, and house servants who could overhear the conversations of Confederate officers. She trained them, taught them her methods of stealth and communication, and began sending them on missions deep into Confederate territory. She was, in effect, running her own spy ring right under the noses of the Union command. It didn't take long for a few of the more perceptive Union officers, men like General David Hunter and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, to recognize the extraordinary asset they had in their midst. They began to consult with her directly, listening to her intelligence reports with a growing sense of awe. This was not second-hand gossip. This was actionable, military-grade intelligence. She could tell them which plantations were poorly defended, where the richest stores of cotton and supplies were, and which river routes were safe for Union gunboats. She was a spymaster, and the Union Army desperately needed one. Her role soon evolved from intelligence gathering to active military planning. She was no longer just providing information. She was helping to shape operations. The culmination of this work, and the single greatest testament to her military genius, came in the summer of 1863. The Union Army wanted to conduct a raid deep into Confederate territory along the Combahee River in South Carolina. The goals were threefold: to disrupt Confederate supply lines, to destroy the plantations of wealthy secessionists, and, most importantly, to liberate hundreds of enslaved people who could then be recruited as soldiers for the Union Army. The operation was dangerous. The river was known to be mined with Confederate torpedoes, and its banks were defended by rebel troops. The Union commanders turned to the one person who could make it happen: Harriet Tubman. This was not a supporting role. She was asked to help plan and then personally lead the mission. She gathered her scouts, confirmed the locations of the Confederate defenses, and identified the plantations that were the primary targets. She worked with the Union gunboat commanders, briefing them on the intelligence, advising them on the safest routes up the river. On the night of June 1st, 1863, she boarded one of the Union steamships, not as a nurse or a passenger, but as a key military advisor and field commander. She was the first and only woman in American history to plan and lead a military raid. As the gunboats steamed up the river under the cover of darkness, Harriet was on deck, guiding them through the treacherous waters, her knowledge of the river's currents and the location of the torpedoes indispensable. When they reached their targets, she led a party of black soldiers, men from the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, ashore. They swept through the plantations with disciplined speed, setting fire to the mansions, barns, and storehouses, destroying the economic engine of the rebellion in that region. But her primary mission was liberation. As the plantations burned, she and her soldiers moved through the slave quarters, telling the enslaved that the day of freedom had come. At first, there was disbelief, then stunned joy. A newspaper correspondent who was on the raid described the scene. Hundreds of enslaved people, carrying bundles of their meager belongings, children in their arms, came running from the fields toward the river, toward the Union gunboats, toward freedom. The correspondent wrote of Harriet Tubman standing on the shore amidst the chaos, a prophetess, watching as the fruits of her raid, over 750 liberated souls, were brought aboard the ships. The sound of the steam whistle, he wrote, was their signal of jubilee. The raid on the Combahee River was a stunning success. It was a military victory, a massive economic blow to the Confederacy, and a powerful act of mass liberation. And it had been led by a former slave, a woman, a figure who defied every single category the 19th century world tried to place her in. The legend of Moses the conductor was now eclipsed by the reality of Tubman the general. She had proven that she could do more than just lead a few fugitives through the woods. She could lead an army, and she was not done fighting. The Combahee River Raid was the peak of Harriet Tubman's official military career, but it was far from the end of her service. For the remainder of the Civil War, she continued to be a vital, if often unheralded, asset to the Union cause. She worked alongside figures who would become legends in their own right, including Colonel James Montgomery and Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the commander of the 54th Massachusetts. She was present in the camps before the famed assault on Fort Wagner, serving as a nurse and a scout, and acting as a living symbol of the freedom those black soldiers were fighting for. She would later recount serving Colonel Shaw his last meal before he led his men on their fateful charge. She was a witness to, and a participant in, some of the most pivotal moments of the war. Her intelligence work never ceased. She moved through the contested territories of the South like a ghost, her small network of scouts providing a constant stream of information to Union generals. Her ability to blend in, to be seen as nothing more than an itinerant farm worker or a traveling cook, made her an incredibly effective spy. She could walk into a Confederate-held town, listen to the conversations in the marketplace, gather information on troop strength and morale, and slip back out before anyone knew she was there. Confederate officers were hunting for Union spies they imagined to be clever white men in disguise. They never once suspected the small black woman with the headscarf who passed them on the road. This invisibility, once a tool of oppression, had become her most powerful weapon. She also took on the dangerous role of a pioneer, a military scout who would move ahead of Union armies as they marched through the South. She would map the terrain, identify potential ambush sites, and locate sources of food and fresh water for the advancing troops. It was incredibly perilous work. If captured, she would have been given no quarter. She would have been tortured for information, and then executed in the most brutal manner imaginable. Yet, she faced this danger with the same calm resolve she had shown on the Underground Railroad. Her faith was her armor. She believed that God, who had guided her through the Maryland woods, was now guiding her through the battlefields of Virginia and South Carolina. But as the war drew to a close in 1865, Harriet faced a new and profoundly insulting battle. The United States government, which had relied on her unique skills, which had tasked her with leading a military raid, which had benefited immensely from her intelligence work, now refused to recognize her as a soldier. When the time came for payment, the bureaucracy that had once valued her expertise now reduced her to a mere contraband nurse. They offered her the meager wages of a cook, refusing to acknowledge her service as a scout and a spy. It was a stunning act of institutional betrayal. For over 2 years of dangerous frontline service, she was paid a total of just $200. And when she applied for a soldier's pension after the war, a benefit she had more than earned, she was denied. For 30 long years, she fought a quiet, frustrating war against the government's bureaucracy. She submitted affidavits from the very generals she had served, men who testified to her invaluable contributions as a scout and a spy. Her case was championed by powerful allies in Washington, but time and again, her claim was rejected on technicalities. The system simply had no category for a woman, a black woman, who had served as a military commander. They had used her when they needed her, and now, in peacetime, they were determined to erase that inconvenient truth from the official record. This struggle for recognition was, in many ways, as draining as her fight in the war. It was a constant reminder that even after a war fought for freedom, the nation she had helped save was still unwilling to see her as an equal. The injustice was galling. She had faced down slave catchers and Confederate soldiers, but the faceless, indifferent paperwork of the U.S. government proved to be one of her most formidable foes. She was forced to support herself by selling homegrown vegetables, taking in boarders, and relying on the charity of friends and admirers. The woman who had liberated nearly 1,000 people and helped win the war was left to struggle in poverty. Yet, even in these difficult years, her primary focus was never on herself. Her mission of liberation had not ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. She turned her small home in Auburn, New York, a property she had managed to purchase with the help of abolitionist friends, into a beacon of hope for the needy. She took in orphans, the elderly, and formerly enslaved people who had nowhere else to go. Her home became an informal community center, a place of refuge. Her final great project was the establishment of the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a facility dedicated to caring for elderly and indigent African Americans. She fought for years to raise the funds, donating her own meager pension. She was eventually granted a smaller widow's pension, not the soldier's pension she deserved, to the cause. She deeded the property to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, ensuring that her work would continue long after she was gone. Her activism also extended to the burgeoning women's suffrage movement. She became a close friend and ally of leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She attended their conventions, her presence a powerful, living testament to the intersection of the fights for racial and gender equality. When she spoke, her voice, though uneducated in a formal sense, carried the immense weight of her experience. She would tell the stories of her time on the Underground Railroad, of her service in the war. She would speak of the courage of the women she had known, both enslaved and free. To the suffragettes, many of whom had been abolitionists, Harriet was a hero of almost mythic proportions. She was proof that courage and leadership had no gender. She stood as a powerful, and sometimes uncomfortable, reminder to the movement that the fight for the vote could not be separated from the fight for racial justice. She was, in every sense, one of the first intersectional feminists, a woman who understood that no one is free until everyone is free. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Harriet Tubman entered the twilight of her life, not as a forgotten relic, but as a living legend. Her name had become synonymous with the moral courage of the abolitionist cause and the raw heroism of the Underground Railroad. She was no longer just Moses. She was a foundational figure in the story of American freedom. Though she still struggled financially, her home in Auburn became a pilgrimage site. Journalists, historians, and admirers, both black and white, would make the journey to sit with this small, elderly woman and listen to her stories. They would look at her weathered face, see the deep scar on her forehead, and try to comprehend the sheer scale of the life she had lived. In these later years, she found a powerful ally in a local schoolteacher named Sarah Bradford, who recognized the monumental importance of preserving Harriet's story. Bradford interviewed Harriet extensively, painstakingly transcribing her oral history, capturing the stories of her escape, her time as a conductor, and her service in the war. These interviews became the basis for 2 authorized biographies, Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman and Harriet, the Moses of Her People. These books, though written in the sentimental style of the era, were a crucial act of historical preservation. They captured Harriet's voice, her faith, and her memories for a world that was already beginning to forget. The proceeds from these books provided Harriet with a small but vital income, allowing her to continue her charitable work. Her final years were spent at the home for the aged that she had fought so hard to create, a resident in the very institution that was her final gift to her community. Her body, worn down by a lifetime of hardship, injury, and relentless effort, began to fail her. The sleeping spells that had accompanied her since her youth became more frequent, but her spirit remained unbroken. Even in her frailty, she was a figure of immense power and dignity. She was a living link to an era that was rapidly passing into history, a woman who had been born a slave under President Andrew Jackson and would live to see Theodore Roosevelt in the White House. Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, surrounded by friends and family. Her reported last words were a simple, powerful testament to the faith that had guided her entire life. "I go to prepare a place for you." She was buried with semi-military honors in Auburn's Fort Hill Cemetery. A small plaque, provided by a local veterans group, marked her grave, a modest tribute to a woman whose impact on the nation was immeasurable. But the death of Harriet Tubman was the beginning of her second great battle, the fight for her place in the American memory. For decades after her death, her story was often simplified, sanitized, and marginalized. She was remembered, if at all, primarily as the brave conductor of the Underground Railroad. Her more radical, more dangerous, and perhaps more significant roles, as a guerrilla insurgent, a spymaster, and a military commander, were largely written out of the narrative. The image of the kindly Aunt Harriet leading slaves to freedom was more comfortable for white America to digest than the image of Harriet Tubman with a rifle in her hand, leading soldiers on a raid. This erasure was part of the same historical amnesia that had buried the story of the 54th Massachusetts. It was a refusal to grapple with the full, complex, and revolutionary truth of Black resistance. To remember Harriet the General was to acknowledge that the enslaved were not passive victims waiting to be freed. They were active agents in their own liberation, willing to fight and die for it. It was a truth that challenged the paternalistic narrative of a benevolent Lincoln single-handedly freeing the slaves. The Black community, however, never forgot the whole story. In their churches, schools, and homes, the legend of Harriet Tubman in all her facets was kept alive. She was a warrior saint, a prophet, a military genius. She was proof of what was possible. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, she was reclaimed as a powerful symbol of Black power and resistance. Activists saw in her not just a historical figure, but a model for their own struggle. She was a woman who had faced a seemingly invincible system of oppression and had, through cunning, courage, and sheer force of will, found a way to fight back. The late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen a powerful resurgence of interest in her life, with new scholarship uncovering the full, breathtaking scope of her accomplishments. Historians have pieced together the details of her spy network, confirmed the scale of the Combahee River raid, and restored her to her rightful place as a key military figure in the Civil War. The calls to place her image on the $20 bill are a recognition of this rediscovered legacy, a national acknowledgement that her contribution to the American story is as significant as that of any president or founding father. So, what is the final, enduring lesson of Harriet Tubman's life? It is a lesson that transcends race, gender, and time. It is the story of human potential unleashed. It is proof that the most unlikely of people, from the most oppressive of circumstances, can rise to change the course of history. She was a woman in a man's world, a slave in a land of the free, an illiterate field hand who outwitted generals and politicians. Her life shatters every excuse we make for ourselves. It demolishes the idea that we are prisoners of our circumstances. Her story teaches us that true leadership is not about titles or wealth or education. It is about having a moral vision so clear and a will so strong that others are compelled to follow. It is about taking the very things the world uses to diminish you. In her case, her gender, her race, her injury, and turning them into sources of unimaginable strength. Her scar was a mark of oppression, but her visions became a divine GPS. Her small stature made her invisible to her enemies. Her experience as a slave gave her a knowledge of the land that no white general could ever possess. She is a figure of profound, almost terrifying courage. The courage not just to run, but to turn around and go back again and again into the very heart of danger. The courage to lead a military raid. The courage to demand equal pay and a pension from a government that sought to dismiss her. The courage, in her old age, to continue fighting for the rights of women and the care of the elderly. Her life was one long, unbroken act of defiance against a world that constantly told her no. As we close this chapter, we are left with the image of a woman who was, in every sense, a force of nature. She was not a symbol. She was an actor, a shaper of history, a warrior who fought on a dozen different battlefields, physical, political, and spiritual. She proves that one person, guided by an unshakable faith and a deep love for her people, can indeed bend the arc of the moral universe. They said she was damaged property. She proved she was a liberator of souls. They tried to erase her from the history books. She became a permanent star in the American constellation, a North Star by which we can still navigate our own struggles for freedom today. Her journey is over, but her work, the great and unfinished work of building a truly just and equal world, continues, and her spirit, indomitable and fierce, marches on. So, we have the story, the escape, the rescues, the raid, the long fight for recognition. But to truly understand Harriet Tubman is to look beyond the sequence of events and into the very essence of her power. Her life was not just a series of courageous acts. It was a masterclass in a new kind of warfare, a new form of leadership, and a new definition of strength. To grasp her legacy, we must dissect the very weapons she used, and most of them were invisible. Her first and most potent weapon was her faith, but not in the way it is often sanitized and simplified. Her visions, born from the brutal head injury that was meant to break her, became a strategic and psychological tool of immense power. Whether one believes they were divine messages from God or the complex workings of a mind altered by trauma is ultimately irrelevant. What matters is what they did. They gave Harriet a level of certainty that is almost unheard of in human experience. In situations of absolute terror and uncertainty, where any logical person would be paralyzed by fear and doubt, Harriet possessed a clear, unwavering inner compass. When her visions told her to change course, she did so without hesitation. When they told her a path was safe, she walked it with a confidence that inspired everyone around her. This was not blind faith. It was a form of radical, intuitive intelligence. For the people she led, this certainty was a lifeline. In the darkness of the woods, hunted by dogs and men, the one thing they could cling to was the absolute conviction of their guide. Her faith became their faith. Her certainty calmed their panic. In a military context, a commander who can make decisive, unconventional decisions with absolute confidence is a tactical genius. Harriet's visions, whatever their origin, functioned as a kind of divine intelligence network, allowing her to outmaneuver her enemies time and again. The slave owners were using maps and patrols. Harriet was using a direct line to what she believed was the ultimate authority. It was an asymmetrical warfare of the soul, and she was its undisputed master. Her second weapon was her profound understanding of the power of invisibility. The system of American slavery was designed to render black people invisible as human beings, to see them only as bodies, as labor, as property. Harriet took this enforced invisibility and turned it into a cloak of immense power. As a conductor, she moved through the South as a ghost because no one was looking for her. The masters were looking for a mythical, powerful man, Moses. They were not looking for the small, 5-foot-tall woman who might pass them on the road, her face hidden by a bonnet, perhaps feigning the shuffle of an old woman. She understood the psychology of her oppressors. They were blinded by their own prejudice. They could not conceive that the person dismantling their system from within was someone they considered subhuman. She carried this weapon into the Civil War. As a spy, she was effective precisely because the Confederate officers and soldiers she moved among were physically incapable of seeing her as a threat. She was part of the scenery, a background figure in their world. This allowed her to gather information with an ease that no white male spy could ever hope to achieve. She weaponized their bigotry against them. They saw a servant. She was a spymaster. They saw a cook. She was a military strategist. This is one of the most powerful lessons of her life. The things the world uses to define and limit you can, with genius and courage, be transformed into your greatest strengths. Third, we must grapple with the brutal reality of her leadership. The image of Harriet with a gun to the head of a frightened fugitive saying, "You'll be free or die," is a jarring one. It disrupts the comfortable narrative of a gentle, saintly Moses, but it is essential to understanding her. This was not an act of cruelty. It was the terrible, necessary calculus of a wartime commander. Harriet was not running a charity. She was running an insurgency. She understood that a single captured runaway, broken under torture, could compromise an entire section of the railroad, leading to the capture and death of dozens of others, both fugitives and conductors. The mission was paramount. The survival of the network was more important than the fear of a single individual. In that moment, she was not just a rescuer, she was a general, making a hard, cold, tactical decision to protect her forces and ensure the success of the operation. To ignore this aspect of her character is to do her a disservice. It is to reduce a complex, brilliant, and ruthless military leader to a two-dimensional storybook heroine. Finally, her life forces us to completely redefine the concept of strength. In a world that equates strength with physical size, with loud voices, with formal authority, Harriet Tubman stands as a powerful counter-narrative. Her strength was not in her body, which was small and broken by a lifetime of abuse and injury. Her strength was in her resilience, her unshakable will. It was the strength to get up after being knocked down, literally and figuratively. It was the strength to endure decades of poverty and official neglect without ever becoming bitter or abandoning her mission to care for others. It was the strength to face down armed men, treacherous rivers, and the institutional power of the U.S. government, with nothing but the force of her own moral conviction. She proves that true strength is an internal quality. It is the ability to hold on to one's purpose in the face of overwhelming opposition. It is the courage to keep going when every external sign tells you to give up. Harriet Tubman's life is perhaps the most profound example in American history of this principle. She was physically weak, but spiritually indestructible. She was formally uneducated, but a strategic genius. She held no official title, but she commanded armies and changed the course of a nation. She is a testament to the fact that the most powerful force on earth is not an army or a government, but a single human soul set on fire with a righteous purpose. To leave Harriet Tubman in the 19th century is to fundamentally misunderstand her. Her story is not a closed chapter of American history. It is a living document, a timeless manifesto on the nature of freedom, power, and resistance that is, in many ways, more relevant in the 21st century than it was in her own time. She is not just a historical figure to be admired. She is a strategic and moral compass for the struggles we face right now. Consider the modern conversations around leadership. We are inundated with images of leadership that equate it with wealth, with corporate titles, with political office, with social media influence. Harriet Tubman's life is a radical and necessary critique of this hollow definition. She held no office. She commanded no formal army. She possessed no wealth. And yet, she was one of the most powerful and effective leaders America has ever produced. Her leadership was built not on authority, but on trust. People followed her into mortal danger, not because they had to, but because they believed in her. Her power was derived from her character, her courage, and her undeniable record of success. She is a powerful reminder that true leadership is a moral act, not a job title. It is the ability to inspire others to move toward a better future, even when the path is terrifying. In an era of performative, self-serving leadership, Harriet's model of quiet, selfless, service-based leadership is a revolutionary ideal. Her story also forces a profound reevaluation of our understanding of disability. In the context of her time, and even often today, her head injury and resulting narcolepsy would be seen as a profound weakness, a tragic disability that limited her potential. But Harriet did not allow her injury to define her in that way. Instead, she integrated it into her spiritual and strategic framework. She transformed what the world saw as a disability into a source of prophetic strength. This is an incredibly sophisticated and empowering act. She refused to accept the ableist narrative that her body and mind were broken. Instead, she redefined her condition as a unique gift, a direct line to the divine. Her story challenges us to move beyond simplistic narratives of overcoming disability and instead consider the more complex and powerful idea of integrating all parts of our experience into a source of unique strength and insight. She wasn't a hero despite her injury. She was a hero whose unique form of genius was inextricably linked to it. Furthermore, Harriet Tubman stands as one of history's most powerful examples of an intersectional warrior. Decades before the term was even coined, she lived and breathed the concept. She understood instinctively that the fight against slavery could not be separated from the fight for women's rights. She stood on suffrage stages alongside white women like Susan B. Anthony, her very presence a challenge to a movement that too often focused on the needs of privileged white women while ignoring the voices of women of color. She was a living embodiment of the idea that different systems of oppression, racism, sexism, ableism, are not separate issues, but are deeply intertwined. Her life's work was a testament to the principle that liberation must be for everyone, or it is for no one. In our modern struggles for social justice, where the importance of intersectionality is a central and often contentious theme, Harriet's life provides a foundational and clarifying example. She was the original intersectional activist. And what of her role as a military leader? In an age where we are still debating the role of women in combat, Harriet's story feels like a dispatch from a more advanced future. Over 150 years ago, she did what many still argue is impossible. She planned and led a successful military raid. She was not a symbolic figurehead. She was an on-the-ground commander, making life-and-death tactical decisions. Her success demolishes the centuries-old argument that women lack the toughness, the strategic mind, or the killer instinct for warfare. Harriet possessed all of these things in abundance, combined with a fierce, protective instinct that made her fight even harder. To remember her only as a rescuer is to do her a profound injustice. We must remember her as she was, a soldier, a spy, and a general. One of the most effective military leaders of the Civil War, who just happened to be a woman. Finally, her life offers a stark and uncomfortable lesson about the nature of justice and recognition in America. For her 30 years of fighting the U.S. government for the pension she was owed, Harriet revealed a painful truth. America is often more willing to accept the sacrifice of its black citizens than it is to reward their service. The nation that needed her as a general was content to let her live in poverty as a civilian. This pattern is a depressingly familiar one, seen in the treatment of black veterans from every major conflict in American history. Harriet's long, quiet, and ultimately unresolved battle with the pension office is, in its own way, as significant as her raid on the Combahee River. It was her final, protracted war, a fight against an enemy she could not outwit with spycraft or defeat with a rifle. The cold, indifferent, and systemic injustice of the state. Her story reminds us that the fight for freedom does not end when the shooting stops. The battle for recognition, for respect, and for the tangible rewards of citizenship is often a longer and more exhausting war. Harriet fought that war until her dying day, leaving a legacy that is not just one of triumph, but also one of righteous, unfinished business. We began this journey with the image of a broken girl, a piece of damaged property deemed almost worthless in the cruel marketplace of human souls. They said she was flawed, that a blow to her head had left her mind unsound. They looked at her small frame, her sleeping spells, her quiet demeanor, and saw nothing of value. It is the single greatest and most humbling irony of American history that this one woman, this person dismissed and devalued by the system, would become one of its most powerful and effective agents of transformation. Her life stands as the ultimate refutation of the world's shallow judgments. What then is the final verdict on Harriet Tubman? She was more than a conductor, more than a spy, more than a general. She was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the unquenchable human desire for freedom. She was an architect of liberation who used the master's tools, secrecy, deception, and violence, to dismantle the master's house from the inside out. She was a prophet who saw a future that no one else could, and then walked into the heart of the inferno to make that future a reality. She was a warrior who understood that some chains are not broken by prayer alone, but by the determined application of courage, strategy, and when necessary, force. Her story is a necessary corrective to the sanitized versions of history we are so often taught. It reminds us that the struggle for freedom has never been a clean or simple story. It has always been messy, dangerous, and morally complex. Harriet Tubman was not a gentle saint. She was a commander in a brutal guerrilla war, and she did what was necessary to win. To honor her is to honor her in her full complexity. The nurturing nurse and the ruthless disciplinarian, the prayerful visionary and the pragmatic spymaster, the liberator of her people and the armed enemy of the state. In the end, her life poses a profound and deeply personal question to each of us. We may not be asked to lead raids or guide fugitives through treacherous swamps, but every day in our own lives, we are confronted with injustice, large and small. We are faced with choices: to speak up or to stay silent, to act or to remain passive, to risk comfort for the sake of principle, or to choose the easier path. Harriet Tubman's life is a testament to the power of choosing the harder path. It is a reminder that one person, armed with a clear moral purpose and an unbreakable will, can make a difference that echoes across generations. They said she was damaged property. She proved she was the embodiment of American freedom. They tried to pay her as a cook. She had commanded armies. They tried to deny her a soldier's pension. Her legacy is priceless. They tried to reduce her to a simple fairy tale. Her complexity makes her immortal. The next time you hear her name, do not just think of the conductor on the Underground Railroad. Think of the general on the deck of a Union gunboat, leading an army into enemy territory. Think of the spy moving like a ghost through the heart of the Confederacy. Think of the activist on the suffrage stage, demanding a more inclusive vision of freedom. Think of the humanitarian who spent her last years creating a haven for the poor and the elderly. Remember the woman who was born into the deepest darkness America has ever produced, and who spent her entire life as a relentless, unstoppable, and glorious beacon of light. Her work is done, but her story and the challenge it lays before us is eternal. She prepared a place for us, a freer, more just world. It is now our duty to be worthy of it.